Hello. Today I'm going to be talking about the planet. Well, it's not exactly a planet, but it is a centaur, and it's considered by many to act like a minor planet. And that is Chiron, which is currently transiting in late degrees of Aries. This week is a very dynamic week because on April 16th, 2026, the transiting sun in Aries will conjoin and make a cazimi aspect with Chiron at 26 degrees of fire sign, cardinal sign Aries. And what is a cazimi? A cazimi is when the sun and the Chiron will be literally in the heart of the sun. And another way to look at this is the sun is infusing Chiron with solar information and awareness about what Chiron means to each of us individually and also on a collective level. And before I get into that, I want to give you some background on Chiron for those who are not familiar. Chiron was discovered in November of 1977 at 4 degrees of Taurus. And Chiron was named after a mythical centaur, and it was considered a centaur or a minor planet orbiting between the planets Saturn and Uranus. Okay? Now, its transit cycle is approximately 50 to 51 years. However, it has a very erratic orbit. It may spend 9 years in one zodiac sign and 2 years in another. It's been in Aries for quite some time, since 2018, I believe. Now, the myth of Chiron I want to talk about first. In mythology, the stories that we learn help us to understand what these archetypes mean in our own individual lives and also the collective as well. So Chiron was named after a centaur. What is a centaur? Well, a centaur has the upper body of a human torso and the legs of a horse. So it's basically half human, half animal. Okay? So now, when Chiron was born, he was abandoned by his parents. He was rejected by his parents. Yet, thankfully, he was adopted by Apollo and eventually became renowned for his skills in all of the healing arts and medicine, herbs, astrology, botany, archery, the art of warfare. It was believed he was taught all of these healing arts by Apollo. He was mentored by Apollo. Now, in Greek mythology, centaurs were wild, untamed, lustful, and sometimes violent creatures, as I said, with both the human torso and the legs of a horse. So now, one day, all of these centaurs were together, and there was a terrible accident, and Chiron was hit with an arrow, a poisoned arrow by Hercules, poisoned with hydra blood. Because he was immortal, Chiron was immortal, he could not die. So Chiron, who knew all of these healing modalities and helped to heal others, tried so hard to heal himself, but he could not heal the pain. No matter what he tried, he could not heal the pain. But for quite a bit of time, Chiron continued to do the healing work on others and still helped others heal. And when he was helping others heal, he would forget his pain for a while. There came a time when Chiron, he was so desperate, he wanted to be free of his suffering. So he made a deal with Zeus, who had pity on him, to give up his immortality and switch places with Prometheus, who was being punished for stealing fire from the gods. Prometheus, which is really represented by the planet Uranus, was chained to a rock, and each and every day an eagle would come and eat away at his liver, and then his liver would regenerate, and the same thing would happen over and over again, day after day. So Chiron was given permission to trade places with Prometheus, and he would become mortal. So Chiron suffered in the myth for 9 days of that torture to be free of his immortal suffering, so to speak. So now, it's not a coincidence that Chiron, as a centaur or minor planet, orbits between the constraints and limitations of Saturn and the rebellious, progressive, and humanitarian Promethean planet Uranus. So, as I said, Chiron has a 50-year cycle, and each of us has what we call Chiron return if we live long enough at the age of 50 to 51 years old. But throughout our life, we will have Chiron transits to our natal birth chart, or we will have outer planets to our natal Chiron by transit in our birth charts. So the first thing you want to do is understand, where is Chiron in your birth chart, what house is it in whole sign, what sign is it in, to get a deeper understanding, because Chiron represents, briefly, it represents our deepest wounds, our vulnerabilities, our insecurities, where we lack self-confidence, where we may hide, where we may experience shame or guilt or familial trauma or ancestral trauma. It could be any of the above. In Aries, it's a particular kind of wounding, which I will talk about. So now, Chiron entered Aries April 2018. It did retrograde back into Pisces for a little bit, but it's basically been in the fire sign of Aries April 2018, and it will be there through April 2027. However, it will go into Taurus on June 9th, 0 degrees of Earth sign, fixed Earth sign Taurus on June 9th of 2026. 0 degrees is my natal moon. So I've been looking at this. So now Chiron in Taurus will be there for approximately 9 years in that sign. So now, Chiron in our birth charts. So individuals with Chiron on one of the 4 major angles will usually go through a very deep transformative process and eventually become either a mentor, a healer, or a coach, or just somebody who has the wisdom gained from the painful life experiences that they've integrated, that they have conscious awareness of, that they accept. They've come to a place of acceptance and self-love. Therefore, they can share that wisdom with others. So the archetype of the wounded healer comes into play here. Okay? So now, this week on April 16th, we have the Chiron Cazimi. What does that mean? Well, I mentioned the fire sign Aries. It's at 26 Aries. So Chiron is in the heart of the sun on April 16th. You may even feel this on April 15th. So now, collectively, Chiron and Aries is the wounds of war and leadership, which we can really see happening in the greater collective. But I focus on individual birth charts and individual, natal charts. So Chiron's long journey in Aries has been about one's personal identity. Okay, the I am archetype. It's about individual courage, to be a trailblazer, to be a risk taker, to have willpower, to be okay with not being a follower, to be okay with not fitting in with the mold. Okay? It's the ability to take independent action regardless of what other people think, because this is what is true and authentic to one with Chiron in Aries, or other planets in Aries, such as I'll get into also. So now, The last time Chiron was was in Aries before this particular cycle was 1968 to 1977. So if you were born within this time frame, you have Chiron in Aries. So the key words I developed about, when you integrate the Chiron wound, developing courage, not being a follower, being a trailblazer, maybe being a leader of some kind, having willpower, having self-confidence. Well, usually when someone is born with Chiron and Aries, there is some kind of shadow wound. It can manifest as a macho defensiveness behavior, a passive-aggressive behavior. Often I've counseled clients with Chiron and Aries who did not feel safe in their childhood for whatever reason. Home was not a safe place. They didn't feel confident to express themselves authentically, to act on their personal volition and act on their own will. It just wasn't safe to do so. So they had to grow up fast. They had to put on a bravado, despite possibly having tremendous sensitivity on an interior level of their being that they couldn't show. So what should be confidence is projected out as maybe being a bully or being bullied by others, or just not feeling safe in one's own space and life. Okay? Now with this Cazimi coming up at 26 Aries, the sun's going to shine a bright light on each of our Chiron themes in our own life, especially for those with Chiron and Aries. This won't happen for another 50 years, okay? So it would be very interesting for those interested in where their Chiron is to look this up in their whole sign chart. If you can look it up on the astro.com website online. And the next day on April 17th, as I mentioned, 2026, we have a 7 planetary lineup of new moon at 26 degrees of Aries. They're all in the fire cardinal sign of Aries. So this is major, major, major fire. Okay, and we're in a fire horse year. So this is a power-packed, energy-packed area of our birth charts. So I would recommend you find that location and contemplate, how that's manifesting for you. Now, this week we have Mars and Saturn traveling together in Aries, before the Cazimi and the new moon. And Mars basically wants to go, 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 and Saturn puts the brakes on. So we can experience some frustrations or limitations, but at the same time, Mars, can give us the fire energy to conquer those doubts and those insecurities and those roadblocks to really persevere. In traditional astrology, Mars and Saturn are considered the two quote-unquote malefic planets. Well, that bring us trouble and challenges, and we all have them, okay, to one degree or another. So some quotes to really understand Chiron on a deeper level is, here's one quote: "The wound is the place where light enters you," unquote. That was by Rumi. Let's see. Quote, "We cannot change anything unless we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses," unquote. And this is by Carl Jung. Chiron has been often called, quote unquote, the rainbow bridge. And this is where our soul and our personality, our consciousness, our solar consciousness, and our wounding in this life integrate. And, Chiron is the bridge between Saturn. Remember, limitations, blockages, insecurities, fears, doubts, and Uranus, being free. So in the myth, Chiron eventually became free of his suffering by embracing his mortality. But he never gave up. I mean, he still tried to heal himself, and he still continued to heal others. So now, Chiron is really about helping us, especially with this Cazimi, to explore our insecurities, our doubts, our fears, our wounds with compassion and self-love. So now, I'd like to give personal examples, as anybody knows that listens to me on my podcast. And I have some notes here. Now, I personally have Chiron at 6 degrees of Pisces in my 8th house. Conjoin Jupiter at 3 degrees of Pisces in my 8th house. Now, the 8th house, you'll read traditionally, is about shared resources, shared financial resources, taxes, money, inheritance, death and rebirth, sexuality, and trauma. For me, many of these transits, almost all of them have been about loss, about death, and some have been about powerful healing, because the Pisces archetype is about spirituality. It's about compassion. It's a mutable water sign. And Pisces has the ability to empathize with others. So I believe that the work I do now in my adult life for many years, off and on, has been linked to my Chiron in Pisces, especially linked up to Jupiter, which is faith and belief. So I'll give you a few examples of my life experience with Chiron, not too many. So in November of 1977, Chiron was discovered at 4 degrees of fixed Earth sign Taurus. Now, the month before this, so it was around the same degree, I had a friend. I had not yet entered high school, but I was soon to enter my freshman year of high school. I had a friend come down to my parents' summer home to visit me before school started. And we went out in a small boat that my parents owned, which was legal in a bay area. And there was a terrible accident because someone was illegally was trailing a deep sea fishing line in the back of their boat in a very narrow channel near where I grew up. And this line was invisible. And they were obviously taking it out to the ocean, which was further down. But, it caught on the bow of what was called a whale, or a small boat that my parents owned that I was allowed to use. And the line snapped and it went into my friend's right eye. It was a horrific accident. And I had to jump out of the boat. I had to scream and I had to get help. And, I went into shock, basically. She went into shock immediately. She didn't even feel the pain. But, I know I talk about these deep things, but this is my life. So I am going to talk about what really happened. So now, yes, for Taurus was my 9th house. However, in my 10th house, whole sign. But it was squaring my nodes, my points of destiny. And it was conjoining my moon, basically. It was within a few degrees of my moon, which rules my 12th house of hospitals and retreat and loss is one of the meanings of the 12th house. So Chiron squared the nodes I was at a fork in the road. This trauma was going to send me in one direction or another, or was going to trigger me to either feel sorry for myself or to understand and integrate this accident on a deeper level, which I really can't get into in this podcast, but it was significant. Now, let's see. I have some notes here. In I'm going to go back. I'm not going to go back to 1971. I'm going to jump up here a little bit. in more recent years. But I do want to say, 1974 and 1975 and 1976, also before Chiron was actually discovered, Chiron was transiting in Aries at my sun-moon midpoint, and it was opposing my sun in the third house of early education, brothers and sisters, and it was in my ninth house of my belief systems, my faith, religion, and so forth. So that was a really difficult time because we moved from my home that I grew up in, and I had to start eighth grade in a town. I had many friends where I grew up in Massachusetts in a town called Arlington. I had my best friends there. You know, I had a good life there. I did not want to move. I was the oldest of four children at the time. And this was a really difficult move because it was a culture shock going from being a city girl, though it wasn't the city, but it was like a city compared to where I moved out to Dover, Massachusetts. This was a hard move for me. I struggled at the beginning, and you can see this. And the sun moon is, I've mentioned before in previous podcasts, is about relationships, but it's also about our health. Sun is our consciousness, our light, our spirit. Moon is our body. Moon is our emotions. I was really missing my friends. This really impacted my identity on a significant level. I eventually made new friends, and I made a special best friend, and that was the one who experienced that traumatic accident. So that was one example. Let's see. I will jump up. So in November of 1997, Chiron went over the fourth house cusp, which is our home and family access. There was a lot of difficult circumstances going on within my family of origin. My sister is mentally ill. There was a lot going on regarding her situation. I was very much involved. My whole family was. There was a death involved in the greater family that I came from, and there was just so much going on then. So you can see it's relating to my Chiron conjunct Jupiter in Pisces in the 8th house. This was major initiation, this cycle that I was in. And I had to really depend on my faith to get me through this time. Now, 1998, December of 1998, Chiron transit over my natal Venus at 26 degrees of Scorpio in the 4th house of home and family. Now, this was actually a really positive transit, and I'll tell you why. Because this is when I was really heavy into studying astrology. And I felt like when I discovered astrology, and this is the Scorpio archetype, Scorpios love to delve deep. They love to understand things on a deep level, and they love to have deep discussions, and often about deep metaphysical topics, life and death, and so forth. So Venus is love and what I value. And so I felt like this was a healing time, beginning of a real healing journey, because I was understanding previous difficult circumstances I went through an astrological lens. And it really did make a difference. It really helped me understand that there is a pattern that we are born with that mirrors the pattern of our life development. And these transits were showing me this. And that's why I became literally obsessed with studying astrology, because I was so fascinated by all of it. So now, let's see. Chiron went over my midheaven, which is my public status, my vocational direction. Well, I graduated high school in 1980, and I did go to college, but I took a few months off. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I went through kind of an identity crisis then also, but it wasn't, this wasn't a major crisis, but I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. What I really was interested in all this time was the healing arts. But I was persuaded to go to business school. And I don't regret that, but that was not what I was meant to do in retrospect, but also it probably was, because later on I do get into the healing field, and this is what was meant to be. Let's see. So I'm going to jump up to 2005. Chiron again, early 70s. Remember I said it was at my sun moon midpoint? Well, it was at my sun moon midpoint again in 2005 and opposed my sun. And I was diagnosed with chronic Lyme disease. I was bedridden in 2005 for 3 months at least before I got help. Really, I did not really get significant help until January of 2008, and Chiron was transiting over my natal Pluto in Virgo. And think about this, Chiron and Pluto together, it's like healing the wound at its deepest and most darkest place. January 2008 was when I finally got the official diagnosis with the co-infections that I was living with, and also given the right treatment that I had waited several years for. And then I could go further down the line. I've mentioned in previous podcasts, I lost my son in March of 2010. Chiron was conjunct Neptune, opposed Ceres in my first house, the dwarf planet of grief and sorrow. Chiron was very close to my descendant, my relationship axis, my relationship with my husband, opposed my ascendant, my identity. And I have Ceres rising, which means Ceres is about nourishment and the sign of Leo. And so my mothering, my status as a mother was just wounded beyond comprehension. Obviously, there are no words. And then a year later, Chiron had moved into Pisces, and it was in the few degree range of my Jupiter in Pisces and my natal Chiron in Pisces. And we ended up buying a small house in Florida because my husband traveled all the time, and Richie, our son, was our only child. And I was alone on the gray, cold winter days of New England, and I was just miserable. So we ended up buying a house in Florida, in the west coast of Florida. We closed literally on the day of my son's funeral the year before. And this really made a significant difference in my mental health. Being in the sunshine, my husband was still working, he was commuting back and forth, but I was in Florida and it was sunny every day. I was in an environment where everything was new and different, and I had no memories there of raising my son. So that was an example of a healing time due to a death. Again, the 8th house. I had my Chiron return, which happens every approximately 50 years, and 2014, and that is when it really started in 2013. That is when my mother was diagnosed with a terminal illness. Okay, there you go. There's the loss. There's the archetype of death and rebirth. I became a caregiver. And luckily I was in Florida because that's where my parents lived at the time. So you can see this theme of life and death and healing. I could go on and on. I'll give you one more example. Chiron opposed my sun June 2023 through 2025, and that is June 2023 is when my father died. The sun is also the archetypal father. So that was extremely difficult for me because I had lost my whole family prior to my father, who is the last member of my immediate family to die, to pass away. So it was a accumulation of loss that I think, set me into a relapse of the chronic Lyme, which I'm still working on to this day. And Chiron has been at my sun moon midpoint for a couple of years now. Again, my health, remember? It was at my sun moon midpoint when I was I had chronic Lyme disease at the beginning, and here I am back, and Chiron's at my sun moon midpoint. And I'm not to the level, I'm not as sick as I was at the beginning, but here I am, I'm experiencing this to my physical body. So, and I know it's all related. The sun moon midpoint is also relationship, okay? Our primary relationships can go through significant changes. I had and have been in counseling. I've been doing a lot of things to help myself heal from the trauma of losing my family and moving forward, sharing my wisdom gained through the painful experiences I've gone through. And this is an example of Chiron in action in my own birth chart and my own life. We each will have an individual experience of this wounded healer archetype. So I hope you enjoyed hearing all about Chiron. I do want to end this podcast by quoting, this book is called Chiron, Facilitator of Destinies by Roderick Benz. It's an older book, but I love what he says. He says, Chiron, after having been raised by the gods as a god, suddenly faced human limits on his talents, knowledge, and emotions. Yet at the same time, those limits did not extend to being able to simply die because of his immortality. But Chiron continued to help others after his physical, emotional, and psychological wounding. His wound was not the end of his life, but rather a climactic and pivotal moment. After a period of agony and self-pity, Chiron rebounded gloriously to help others to find their destinies once again, though never recovering from his wound on a physical level. The more he aided others in whatever way he could be of service, the more this lessened Chiron's own pain. Chiron embodies shamanic symbolism. The shaman is one who, as a consequence of personal psychological crisis, has gained a certain power of his own. This suggests Chiron's powers then actually increased after his wound once he accepted his fate. Humankind has the capacity and the built-in expectation to be both human and God, to exist with human frailties while reaching for enduring greatness. So his archetypal legacy to humankind is that all men and women are both mortal and divine. So, some food for thought with this week with the Sun Chiron Cazimi and the new moon planetary lineup in Aries. Wishing you a great week. Bye for now.